Hello, and thank you for joining us in Mapping the Zone, the newest podcast dedicated to informal discussion of the works and context of Thomas Pynchon. My name is Cody. I'm one of the co-hosts here. And today we are talking Chapter 2 of The Crying of Lot 49.
Hi, I'm Will.
Hey, I'm Luke.
All right. So, Will, you've got a little summarization of Chapter 2 for us, if you want to go ahead and read that.
Yeah, so this chapter begins with Oedipa telling Mucho her plans to go to San Narciso, a town near Los Angeles, to acquaint herself with Inverarity's holdings and her co-executor Metzger. He's disappointed, but she leaves, saying not to talk to Hilarious and to take care of the plants. She rents an Impala and drives down, at first finding San Narciso fairly difficult. Suddenly, though, she has the sense of trying to read a printed circuit board, a religious instinct of witnessing but not comprehending arcane meaning. A moment of compassion for her husband's search for his own in radio music, seeing without believing. She continues on into a neighborhood from the freeway. The line of escrow services and factories is extensively interrupted by a pink and barbed wire campus, the Galactronics branch of Yoyodyne Incorporated, an aerospace behemoth central to the town's economy that Inverarity had in some way helped found and still owned a large part of. It eventually fades behind more warehouses and beige businesses. Tired of the endless varieties of sameness, Oedipa pulls into Echo Courts, a motel advertised with an illuminated and softly pornographic 3D depiction of a nymph mid-flirtation. The face looks remarkably like her own. The manager, a teenager who looks ready to audition for a knockoff of A Hard Day's Night named Miles, carries her bags to her room while singing in the style of the British invasion. Oedipa asks why, and he replies that his band, the Paranoids, had been recommended the accent by their manager. She offers to pass along a demo tape to Mucho, which Miles takes as an offer of quid pro quo, and he starts to move in. Brandishing the television antenna, Oedipa declines. Miles takes the rejection badly. He expects and receives the tip anyway. Later that night, Metzger arrives carrying a bottle of French wine and makes a striking impression. Oedipa can't believe he's not an actor for a moment. He invites himself in, and is happy to simply drink out of the bottle, since the motel had provided only one glass. Metzger starts to lay down some game, spilling his guts about his mother pushing him into acting as a child, shares supposed sexual insecurities. She calls him on it. He changes the subject, proffering that Pierce had only mentioned her to him on one occasion. She declines to hear what Inverarity told the lawyer, turns on the TV, tuned into a program that Metzger claims he starred in as Baby Igor, a war movie called Cashiered. Apparently, Baby Igor played the son of a man unjustly dishonorably discharged from the British Army who builds his own submarine, the Justine. With his son and their St. Bernard, they torpedo Turkish merchant ships. Oedipa realizes that this was all either a lie, or he'd paid someone at the station to broadcast it. Metzger begins demonstrating some degree of confusion of identity between himself and his childhood role, insisting he knows what really happened. Before Oedipa can address this, she's distressed by the sudden lack of wine in their bottle. Metzger, prepared, reveals one of tequila, and incidentally unveils his knowledge of her and Inverarity's trip to Mexico. He says it had been written off in Pierce's taxes that year when she asks how he knows, and she responds with venom. Metzger proposes a wager on the outcome of the movie, happy or sad. Initially declining, Oedipa is eventually convinced to bet, but when he refuses to suggest stakes, she offers a blank check. He accepts and French kisses her hand. Oedipa demands to hear some explanations about the movie, which seems to be erring with the reels out of order. He accepts as long as each question is tendered with a garment, which he calls strip-Botticelli. Oedipa accepts, then slips into the bathroom, which adjoins the closet. Metzger continues rambling about stuff the actors on screen didn't know about the real events. In the bathroom, Oedipa dresses herself with 36 additional pieces of clothing and an untold quantity of jewelry. Finally, she begins to leave the room before spying her image in the mirror, laughing so hard as to fall over, breaking the nozzle off a canister of hairspray as she went. It rockets off, bouncing and flying off walls, and Oedipa is stuck rolling on her mock turtle shell. Metzger comes in to save the day, only to be nearly missed by the can and drop to the floor himself, trying to predict where it'd end up. Overwhelmed, Oedipa bites into his arm through his suit. The can shatters the mirror and a panel of frosted glass in the shower and keeps ricocheting until it eventually peters out and clatters to the floor. Miles has invited his band into Oedipa's room, plying his master key, and they have gathered at the bathroom door, gazing in with a clutch of groupies around. One of them asks if the impromptu couple were up to a London thing. Oedipa convinces them to leave, asking them to serenade them from outside. They come to the window and listen to a shockingly generic and soliloquacious serenade from the paranoids. Finally, the game. Oedipa pours herself some of the Jack Daniels left behind by the crowd and trades 3 earrings for a handful of barely informative answers about the success of baby Igor and Ko's mission. Frustrated by this compensation, Metzger discards his coat in a demonstration of generosity. They drink some more. This continues for a while, the attorney taking the time during commercial breaks to inform her of Inverarity's stake in each successive brand. Eventually, Oedipa visits the bathroom again, so drunk she sooner assumes she can't recognize herself than remembers that the mirror is broken. Oedipa puts on a few more pieces before coming out, to find Metzger asleep with his head under the couch and naked except for the tent of boxers across his lap. She falls onto him and kisses him awake. That seeming to take the last of her energy, she lays nearly limp as he undresses her and falls in and out of sleep. She wakes to the build of a mutual orgasm, coinciding with the paranoids plugging in more guitars, and the release seems to overload the circuit. The lights go out. When they come back on, the Justine is filling with water. The dog drowns, baby Igor is shocked to death by an electrical short. By some miracle living, the father delivers a eulogy and apology, declaring his split destiny from his son, expecting hell. It's implied he drowns as the end card fades in. Oedipa shouts in celebration of a bet well won. The last 6 lines are, "You won me," Metzger smiled. "What did Inverarity tell you about me?" she asked finally. "That you wouldn't be easy." She began to cry. "Come back," said Metzger. "Come on." After a while, she said, "I will." And she did.
A lot happens in this chapter, so I think we've got our work cut out for us here. I mean, let's start from the beginning. I like the kind of immediate jump into humor with the kind of Beatles knockoff of "I Want to Kiss Your Feet." That song title just always makes me wish that song actually existed, because that sounds like some Weird Al kind of thing, and I'm 100% in for it.
Well, that's a little personal. No, it does sound exactly like a Weird Al track, though.
It really does, and and I think maybe that has to do with that time, because that was obviously before Weird Al, but I think, if I'm not mistaken, that's around the time that like Dr. Demento was on the air, maybe like starting to air stuff. It still puts a smile on my face every time I read it. I guess before we really kind of dive into the discussion of the chapter, what were your takeaways from? Like, how did you feel about this particular chapter?
I thought it was interesting that there's so many references to narcissism in the chapter. I mean, the San Narciso, Narciso obviously brings to mind narcissism. Then Echo Quartz, I want to say Echo is a character in the Narcissus myth.
Yeah, she falls in love with him, if I remember right.
Yeah, and then Metzger, as a child actor turned lawyer, does seem a bit narcissistic, more than a bit, perhaps. And then, I mean, if you could kind of interpret all of this whole chapter. I mean, going back to some stuff I talked about last week, the possibility of so much of this chapter being in some way fake or constructed just to mess with Oedipa, which would signify a kind of narcissism on the part of Pierce, in terms of, he's so self-centered that he could have created a whole town and a whole fake movie and all of this stuff just to mess with his ex-girlfriend, which implies a certain amount of self-importance.
Yeah, I'm not sure I take it as necessarily a construction of Pierce's, but
I think that's a possible interpretation. I don't necessarily want to die on that hill.
Yeah.
No, it's absolutely possible that Pierce is like, "Hey, screw you for leaving me. I'm gonna pay my lawyer by giving him the information and having a bootleg film produced so that he can seduce you." That's really not out of the character of Pierce that we've seen so far.
Yeah. I definitely agree. I think the two kind of the bigger themes that popped out in this chapter for me were, as Luke was saying, the narcissism of specifically Pierce, And then this is, I think, the chapter where the theme of paranoia really starts to take hold. And it's for anyone familiar with Pynchon, like paranoia is a common thematic element throughout his work. And I think this is where we really start to see that come into full focus, with not only as Luke mentioned, how much of this did Pierce have a hand in? Did he, didn't he? Oedipa even starts to question a lot of the goings on of things. And, there's specific mention, like she calls Miles a paranoid, and not necessarily calls him much, it kind of reinforces that idea because he kind of claimed it himself. But then she starts to kind of, get a feeling of everything that's happening, the too many weird things and impossibilities kind of happening concurrently.
Yeah, I mean, Miles assuming that Oedipa is trying to get with him, or use her connection to her husband to get with him, also implies a certain amount of narcissism on Miles's part, because from the way it's phrased in the book, I mean, it's pretty obvious that Oedipa was just trying to be nice, and then Miles takes it in a very like self-centered and presumptuous way. And Metzger also seems to kind of even just like showing up at a hotel room with liquor seems to imply a fair amount of presumption on Metzger's part.
Oh yeah, most definitely.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and Miles even has that line in talking about his attempt to kind of get with Oedipa, where Miles closed the door behind him and started in the doorway with a shifty eye. In return for what? Moving in on her. Do you want what I think you want? This is the payola kid here, like that level of confidence in a kid who's 16 years old and a hotel manager. Yeah, there's a huge kind of narcissistic side of him shown there.
Yeah, and in narcissism, that it's commonly viewed as, being so full of yourself that you can't believe that you're not great. And what research has shown in the past, 30, 50 years is that narcissism is usually a case of incredibly small ego, incredibly weak sense of self and self-worth, reflected outward with hostility. And that is a certain way to interpret paranoia in general.
Yeah, I mean, paranoia, you could perhaps make the argument that paranoia could be an aspect of narcissism, or that narcissism has a paranoid aspect. Paranoia is this weird feeling of like everything is connected, or people are out to get me in particular, which can imply a certain amount of like self-centeredness, also psychosis. But I think you get what I'm saying.
Yeah, definitely.
Absolutely. Yeah. And also, I the other, in mentioning paranoia, and especially as it ties to Pynchon, this is also the first time in the book that we get they with a capital T, which for those familiar with a lot of Pynchon's work that's the kind of overarching, the royal they, so to speak, where the powers that be, or whoever's, running things. In this case, it could be Pierce and his cohorts, but that's, I always kind of keep an eye out for when the capital they shows up in anything.
Might be the first time that happens in Pynchon's work.
Yeah, I don't know that it was in V.
I don't think it was. I could be wrong.
I mean, it's been a long time since I read V, but I find it hard to believe that Stencil didn't at least use they in the same way.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
It could be. We'll find out.
I have a sense of a reading of what happens in this chapter. I'm not going to just walk through it, my argument, but I'm going to ask, what are y'all's interpretations of Metzger as he arrives? Because he's kind of shown as gallant and goofus in the same breath.
Yeah. There's it was kind of like it was kind of character whiplash for me. Like, he initially comes in and, showing up with alcohol, like Luke said, that's a big kind of red flag. But I kind of just was like, all right, whatever. He's, maybe he doesn't have ill intent. He just wants to, be a good, not a host necessarily, but just show up and be able to provide something. and then the whole thing with him being a child actor comes in and how his mom mistreated him, and you kind of like in watching the film that just happens to be on TV that he was in, and you kind of get the sense of like what he was put through as a child actor. You kind of start to feel bad for him, but then as towards the end of the chapter, it just became a complete 180. I just was like, this guy's a slime ball. I don't like him at all.
Yeah, and I think he is shown to lie. I want to say because he says that Pierce only like told her like they only had one conversation about Oedipa,
right?
And then by the end of it, it does seem pretty obvious that he does have a fair amount of insider information about Oedipa, like more than he revealed at the beginning.
Mm-hmm. Well, he kind of peppers in like the more things show up on TV, like commercials for things like, oh yeah, Pierce owns that, Pierce has that, Pierce did that.
Yeah, and I mean,
it's clear they have a relationship that extends beyond the will.
Yeah, and I mean, it is also a little suspicious thinking of the way TVs used to work, and even the way TVs work now, where like, Oedipa and Metzger aren't shown like flipping through the channels trying to find something to watch. It just seems to be like she turns on the TV and it's already on the right channel. I want to say that there were a lot less channels back then, like less than 10, maybe, but it's still suspicious to me.
It is. I mean, it's very much it in its own way is very much the TV, where, when someone in a movie or a TV show turns on a TV, it's always at like the right point in the news broadcast or the right part of the movie that they're going to watch, or the TV show. That like it's always queued up just right. So yeah, it's definitely that.
So there's two things I found interesting about this chapter. They're both kind of not super important. I reread this book around the time when I was rewatching The Last of Us, and there's a reference to the wine called
the French Bourgeois.
Yeah, which comes up in the third episode of The Last of Us, which is just kind of weird to me. That it's kind of a weird synergy thing. A little aside about that is that he says that he had to smuggle it, and I don't, like French wine has never been illegal in the U.S., which is another part where he kind of lies or is trying to.
I think he was trying to sell himself up. Yeah, exactly.
The other thing I thought was interesting was I'm a big Beach Boys fan, and the Serenade repeats the phrase "Lonely Sea" a bunch, and I looked it up, and that song, the Beach Boys have a song called "Lonely Sea," and it's on the album Surfin' USA, which would have been their first like famous album, and that came out in 1963, which we talked about last week is probably when this took place. But I do think, I mean, if you listen to The Lonely Sea by the Beach Boys, it is kind of a slower tune. It's kind of a little bit more slow pace. It's more of a, like literally a serenade, kind of like the song is titled. I thought it was kind of an interesting little tidbit that could also like kind of inform us on when this is taking place, what year.
I'm curious if the lyrics to it sync up with that song, the Beach Boys song.
I very well could, I think, because I did listen to this song a little bit, and "Lonely Sea" is repeated a fair amount, and yeah, I'm not a musician, so I wouldn't really be able to tell like singing it or something, but
yeah, I totally noticed some Beach Boys influence, but I didn't know about the song on the Lonely Sea. To me, the whole serenade was impressively generic. I don't like. There doesn't actually seem to be any implication of love or emotion other than loneliness.
It does seem to kind of fit in with Oedipa's kind of general like anhedonia, like her kind of general like withdrawal from the world, her general like I mean, I would call her depressed, clinically depressed. I would say like she does exhibit a fair amount of the symptoms of depression, especially, well, I mean, kind of increasingly so over the course of the book now that I think about it. But even her kind of, she kind of just like lets the stuff with Metzger happen. She's not a super, she doesn't have a lot of agency or control in this book. She seems to kind of just, later in the book, she gets a little bit more. She seems to be taking control of her own life a little bit more, but especially at the beginning, she just kind of seems to be floating along.
And I think that's also evident at the end of the chapter too. The kind of resignation that she has after what happens.
Yeah, this all kind of goes together for what I think the central question of this chapter is kind of an ugly one. It is, how consensual was the sex? Getting it out of the way. It is not consensual in the end.
No,
but in terms of
absolutely not.
how much does she want it in the first place? How much does she want it in the moments before falling asleep? How much would she have wanted it if she hadn't fallen asleep? All of those things are really the central mystery here.
Especially, you know, when you look back at the layering, and it's presented in a sort of comical way when she's, you know, bundling up to the point where Metzger almost can't win his little game, but there's still an element of her interest in it up until, you know, I think at the end, you know, as you said, it's absolutely not consensual, you know, when the moment happens, but it's ambiguous as to how she really felt. And I think that that ties again back into what Luke was mentioning about her, you know, possibly being depressed. You know, they're suffering from chronic depression. It's hard. It was a hard ending for me every time. I've read this book a few times, and that's a hard part for me to get through.
Yeah, and something interesting I found, and I'm asking listeners, write in, comment if we post this anywhere. Tell us, because in my experience, people who read this book for the first time read this as a funny rom-com scene.
Mm-hmm.
And then by the end of the book, when they look back at it, they start to realize just how coercive Metzger had been.
Yeah, and so this is going to be me putting on my tinfoil hat a little bit. But I mentioned last week that I read a self-published book of scholarship on Lot 49. Yeah, so I actually didn't pick up on this, but it's possible, and this is a bit of a spoiler, I guess, but it's possible that she got pregnant from, you know, this what happened with Metzger, and later has a miscarriage. The guy was trying to say that, like, her getting pregnant and then, like, Metzger and her having sex right off the bat and her getting pregnant was, like, he built this whole thing out of the Tibetan Book of the Dead and the fact that, in the Tibetan Book of the Dead, you are, like, a person's soul after they die is in the bardo, which is, like, after death, like, kind of a limbo state before you're reincarnated, and you're in the bardo for 49 days, according to the Tibetan Book of the Dead, which is, I do think is telling, because, you know, the 49 doesn't seem to be, you know, it seems a little bit random in this book, the fact that it's, you know, not crying of Lot 59, so that could be somewhat intentional. But he was going on and on about this guy who, he was a professor, but it was not in English. He was like a science professor, and after he retired, he got into literary scholarship. But he was going on and on about how, like, her getting pregnant was supposedly, like, Pierce trying to reincarnate himself through her and through Metzger and them having sex. Calling it sex is also a little bit... Have we used the word rape yet?
No, but that's what it was. It's what it was.
Yeah, I mean, if a woman or whoever falls asleep during sex and you continue, then yeah, that's obviously rape. I agree. And I do think it's telling that, you know, at the end of the chapter, you know, she cries. And it doesn't seem like to be like a long period of time after doing what they did. So
I'm not, you know, I'd like you to send me a link to that book because I'd like to read more. But there's the facet of the Lot 49 having been a fairly important auction of real estate in the Pynchon family history, from what I understand. So that there's a little bit of there's some real world connection to Pynchon that would give us the name that isn't necessarily the Book of the Dead. That doesn't mean he wouldn't take influence from it, but that does mean that I'm hesitant to suspect that this scene ended in a pregnancy that was never mentioned explicitly and is alluded to very, very vaguely in the sense of like a psychotic episode rather than a miscarriage.
Yeah, it's a bit ambiguous. I enjoyed reading that guy's book. It's called New Close Readings of The Crying of Lot 49.
Is it a full book or is it just like
it is? It's like 12 articles. He does go on about Pynchon and Buddhism and Tibetan Buddhism and the differences between Buddhism and Tibetan Buddhism and the differences between modernism and postmodernism. He says that he goes on about how modernism focused on Buddhism and then postmodernism is more focused on Tibetan Buddhism, which there is the Book of the Dead reference in this chapter, which the Pynchon Wiki seems to link more towards the Egyptian Book of the Dead, which I'm not as familiar with. I've read the Tibetan Book of the Dead at least twice, two different translations. Him throwing in the Book of the Dead, it seems to be a bit of a non sequitur. They're talking about the a map of the little like private, like the gated community in San Narciso, and it says, so she's reminded of her look downhill this noontime, which I think is, she's reminded of the neighborhood looking like a circuit board. And so then it says some immediacy was there again, some promise of hierophany, printed circuit, gently curving streets, private access to the water, Book of the Dead, which in that context, Book of the Dead is a bit of a non sequitur. It's also, it reminds me of in White Noise, whenever DeLillo ends a chapter with a one-word paragraph, Panasonic. You know, it's kind of, it's a bit like a tone poem or something, you know, like it's just meant to be evocative. But in the context of like literal meaning, it's not, it scans as somewhat random. But I do think that's kind of telling in and of itself, that it's thrown in there in the context of like suburbia and gated communities and stuff.
Yeah, I think he does make another reference to, I think, the Egyptian Book of the Dead later on in Lot 49. So I wouldn't be surprised if the Bardo is an important, tie-in to the themes of the novel. That wouldn't surprise me at all.
Yeah, and even because the Tibetan Book of the Dead seems to me to be about like an in-between state, a state of, you're not reincarnated yet, you're not alive, you're not dead really, you're in this, your soul is kind of floating through this kind of like plane of existence that has both in the Western way of speaking, both like heaven and hell aspects to it, which, I mean, maybe to make a big deal out of something that may not need to be made a big deal out of, but it does kind of seem to relate to the book itself, where, something that I've been focusing on more, but you can't tell, it's you can come up with a bunch of different interpretations about this book. It's like everything is uncertain, I guess. It's a very, like, the Bardo seems to be like a place where things are uncertain, and this whole book is kind of, seems to be like there's a lot unstated, and it seems to be like the reader is meant to be uncertain, even like throughout the entire thing. So
yeah, the Bardo is kind of the holding, the processing room for the work of samsara, the chain of suffering and death and life in the universe. And so it's, as Oedipa begins to figure herself as the adjudicator of what's real and what's not, it does definitely start to tie into that somehow.
I see where you're coming from with it, and it's something I kind of want to dive into a little bit more and see if there's more to that, because I like where you're going with it, and I'm curious to see where it could go.
Yeah.
But I'll kind of piggyback on what you mentioned in that, with the mention of the comparison of the city with the circuit board. I loved that imagery when Oedipa's first driving in and she sees how it's all set up. And there's that quote in there: she looked down a slope, needing to squint for the sunlight, onto a vast sprawl of houses which had grown up all together like a well-tended crop from the dull brown earth. And she thought at the time she'd opened a transistor radio to replace a battery and seen her first printed circuit. The ordered swirl of houses and streets from this high angle sprang at her now with the same unexpected, astonishing clarity as the circuit had. I think it's interesting, especially given the time that this book came out and you were starting to see those kind of neighborhoods pop up more and more, and how it led to an increase in that kind of closer communication. Like, people were closer at that point than they ever really had been. And so it allowed for information to move more freely, but also more consequentially, because it becomes like a game of telephone where information gets distorted as it goes further and further down the line, which I think is also important in terms of the book and what comes later with, waste and all that kind of stuff, and the interconnectedness of all of that. And I think I remember listening to Books of Some Substance. They did an episode on this book, and they were talking about how Pynchon's time at Boeing would have kind of coincided with the earliest facets of what ended up becoming the internet, and that connectivity and the ability to communicate over long distances like that. And I couldn't help but think about that when I reread this and got to that part about the circuit board and the neighborhood and the way the kind of comparison of those two things.
Yeah, I mean, I want to say its death is just around the corner. Talks about Pynchon and the Beaumark project, BOMARC. It's a acronym. Whenever you Google Beaumark, at least for me, it comes up. First thing that comes up is Wikipedia, and the first paragraph talks about how it's a unverified conspiracy theory. But I want to say that the general summary of the Beaumark project, which I don't think we have confirmation that Pynchon worked on it. I don't think we have confirmation on a lot of stuff that Pynchon worked on or didn't work on. But I think the summary of the Beaumark stuff, which again, the death is just around the corner guy talks about, is the Beaumark stuff was like communication between nuclear missile sites. So say Russia launched nukes, then the Beaumark project was setting up, like it was alerting all these different nuclear sites as to like whether or not to launch or not, is my understanding of it.
Yeah, and it's a little more firmly confirmed that he did work on documenting the SAGE project, which was the direct predecessor to ARPANET, and may have been the underlying technology of Beaumark, whether that existed or not.
Yeah, and the Inherent Vice gets into that too, I want to say, especially the ARPANET. And I have done some research into it, and I want to say that a lot of that stuff, the precursors to the internet, I want to say the first precursor to the internet really was like one California university professor sending a message, basically an email, on like a closed like LAN system to a professor at another California university. I want to say that's what it is. It's been a while since I've done any research on that, because I did it around when I was reading Inherent Vice.
That's definitely the lore. The lore is it was one of the UC schools, maybe probably Berkeley, and either another UC school or Nevada sent a message to one another. But let's be honest with ourselves, we don't know. Like, the military was developing ARPANET long before the public saw it, and there's no reason to believe whatever they've endorsed is the official story there.
No, yeah, you're definitely right. That's one thing that we'll get into probably with Gravity's Rainbow is the military-industrial complex and stuff like that, which I do think. I think I wrote down the military-industrial complex in my. Let me have a look.
Well, I mean, while you're looking for that, this is also, the Yo-Yo-Dyne thing is obviously that's obviously Boeing. Interesting because
there's another Dyne company, Rocketdyne maybe.
Oh, that's true. See, I always read it as kind of a thinly veiled Boeing connection to his time there, but I could be wrong. It's just speculation.
Well, so Rocketdyne was an American rocket engine design and production company headquartered in Canoga Park in the western San Fernando Valley.
Okay.
So in this particular case...
Yeah.
But more generally, I think Yo-Yo-Dyne is just an amalgamation of all the different aerospace giants.
That's one thing, this is a bit of an aside, that's one thing Mad Men gets into later in the show's run, is how many rocket companies and general military industrial complex companies were in California around this time. So I found the military industrial complex thing. I underlined the part about Pierce. I think she's quoting Pierce saying that he was a founding father, which I wrote in the margin of the military industrial complex ? So, is Pierce a founding father of that whole thing? Because I mean the military industrial complex, if you think about it, I mean, I'm not an expert on early American history or even like the 1800s, the 19th century. But I do know that I think the first time the military industrial complex was called that, it was the first time in public, at least, it was Eisenhower in like 1959 or 1960 in his farewell address. He warned the U.S. citizens about the strength of the military industrial complex.
Sounds right.
Yeah. It was definitely Eisenhower who kind of popularized it. But I do find it interesting that Pierce could have been a founding father of that business cartel, basically.
Yeah, this is stepping outside of the realm of Lot 49 itself a bit, but you have to think about who Major Chicklets was in Gravity's Rainbow, and how did, in the space of 15 years, he go from ordering Slothrot to be maimed to running a multinational aerospace titan. The only explanation of that is someone like Pierce, someone who already had a lot of money, giving him a huge head start.
I definitely think Pierce being referred to as a founding father could definitely, refer to a military industrial complex type of situation. I think it also just refers to his grip over this entire area of the country, especially going through later in the chapter and finding out, like, all the times Metzger's like, oh yeah, Pierce owns that, Pierce started that, Pierce did that. I think it kind of implies that, like, he's kind of responsible for the development of this area and what it's becoming.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And in that same sense of America.
To go back to the Gravity's Rainbow thing, I did find it interesting that there's a few different things, but the part where the hairspray bottle is caromming around the bathroom, it does. I think it specifies that its flight is basically random, which Gravity's Rainbow gets into a lot with how random the V2 was, like where it landed.
Mm-hmm. What is it? The Poisson distribution?
Yeah, which is definitely, and we'll get into this when we get into Gravity's Rainbow, but that is, it's basically, think about if the U.S. launched a nuclear missile and it was random where it would fall. It's pretty terrifying.
Yeah.
Another thing I find interesting about that is that he talks about how, like, a computer, or he says a digital machine might have computed in advance the complex web of its travel, which I'm not an expert on computers at all, but I'm under the impression that, like, a computer in the 1960s would not have been capable of charting all the different, like, air, like air temperature, air humidity, all the different variables. I'm under the impression that computers would not have been able to do that. So it is kind of cool that I do think that we have computers that could do that now, however, but it is kind of cool that he seems to be predicting the rise in computing power.
Yeah, I think he was definitely cued into what the capabilities that computer technology had at that time, that it maybe wasn't there, but where it could go.
Yeah, and I think the slightly more not important, because you're absolutely right. The computer thing is prescient, and it does show that this guy has seen what computers are about to do. He probably wrote some documents for some self-guided missiles as early as it was in the 50s. He starts it by saying God or a digital machine. It's not about the computer being able to do it. It's about the fact that we as people are so small as to be incapable. It's more of a situation of our weakness than one of computers' power. At least that's how I read it.
That's a cool. Yeah, I agree. That's a cool way of thinking about it.
Yeah, I may be way off base here, but there's a part right before Baby Igor's song. He's describing a scene in the Cashiered movie, and it talks about the father, son, and Saint Bernard. The dog sits on Periscope watch and barks if he sees anything. I immediately thought of Pugnax from Against the Day and the learned English dog from Mason and Dixon. But more so Pugnax and his kind of role within the Chums of Chance. I don't know if y'all got that vibe from that. I thought it was a silly little thing to pick up on, but I just thought it was interesting.
Definitely, and I think it's something deep in my well of memory from watching Boomerang as a very small child tells me that there was some show like Johnny Quest that had a monkey, or was that like Space Ghost Coast to Coast in the 90s or something? I don't know. All of those shows have been parodied so many times that I'm not sure what's what at this point.
Yeah, it's hard to say. I don't know. I never really watched a lot of Johnny Quest. But I know what you're talking about, and there probably was something that fell into that. But
there's even and this is obviously way after these books came out. Maybe not after Against the Day, but there's the high school I went to. Anchorman was, we would always quote Anchorman to one another, and there's the part where Ron Burgundy says, like, Baxter, I don't speak Spanish. Mm-hmm. To the dog, which is, the dog, it's just kind of funny, like anthropomorphizing, I think is the word, dogs.
Yeah.
Which has always been, it's That does seem to be a recurring theme with Pynchon.
So why do you all think that he puts 3 songs in this chapter? Because that's a lot even for him.
It is, and it's also the first time that we get a song. I don't know why there's 3, and I don't know that there really needed to be either. As much as I love his songs, I mean, really, Miles' song is the only one that I really thought was, I don't want to say was necessary, but it was the only one that felt right to be there. The Baby Igor song, I get it. I get why it's there. And then the Lonely Sea one, kind of the same thing, but it just really didn't do anything for me.
Yeah, I mean, the Lonely Sea, the one thing that comes up for me is just it seems to be, as we were talking about earlier, like a commentary on how Oedipa does seem lonely in this chapter and in general. It does seem to be implied in the first chapter that her and Mucho are not necessarily, if they're in love, then it's not necessarily a super healthy relationship. And if I would argue that they're probably not in love, that it seems to be kind of a marriage of convenience, you know?
Yeah.
So it does seem, and then, you know, that song does kind of lead into that part we were talking about where Pierce takes advantage of, or not Pierce, Metzger takes advantage of her falling asleep and everything. It just, I mean, it could be a commentary on her depression.
That's true. I think like what I liked about Miles' song, I think it does a lot for his character in a little bit of time. Like you really, it reinforces his narcissism, that whole idea of like, you may not think I'm the right, you know, person to get with, but I know I'm cool. I know I'm awesome. So, you know, shut up and deal with it kind of thing.
Yeah, it's kind of a sour grapes song, which is,
yeah.
I'm not a huge rockabilly or British Invasion era fan. Is that like a mood that was often tackled?
I really don't know. I never got too much into that scene either. It certainly feels like it's done well enough to feel like it, but I don't know for sure. Like, you know, as much as I like the Beatles, and I'm not a huge Beatles fan, I don't recall that being anything. Maybe it was in a subtle way of just more of like a, oh, you don't want to be with me, I guess I'll go over here for a while kind of thing.
That song, the lyrics, I do think it could be like, I've done some delving into 1960s garage rock music, which I think would be, that movement I think is more mid 60s to late 60s, I want to say.
The garage rock, yeah, for sure.
Yeah. I don't think it's as early as 1963, and it's definitely, it didn't have a lot to do, it maybe was even a reaction against the British invasion. You know, it seems to be a pretty American thing, but for some reason the lyrics that I'm looking over right now, like there's that pretty famous garage rock song 96 Tears, and it does seem to be like, it does seem like it is kind of like that self-conscious coolness of garage rock and maybe even punk rock later on, where it's kind of like, you know, I'm cool and I know it, so if you don't think I'm cool, like fuck you type of thing.
Well, and the Stones did have a certain degree of that braggadocio compared to the Beatles, at least.
Stones for sure did, yeah.
A lot more of an edge to them, yeah.
And I'm trying to think about how like other lyrics later on that were similar to that in any of their songs, but I don't recall.
The later on in like chapter whenever they're at Fangoso Lagoons. No, sorry, after that, when Metzger has run away with the drummer's girlfriend, he writes a song that is in a similar tone there, that is, you know, more of a direct mockery of Lita and stuff.
I know, that's like right towards the end of the book, like in the last chapter, I think.
Something back there. The last 3 melt together for me.
Yeah, I think I remember that now.
Speaking of that part with Metzger, I am trying to find it right now, but I do think, doesn't Metzger like offer the kids like alcohol or try to get them to drink with them or something?
Yeah, he shares what they call tequila sours.
Yeah.
With them, and also, but he is also, you know, they hand him like a joint and stuff.
They left a bottle of Jack Daniels with them too.
But it does seem like Metzger was trying to get them in the party with him and Oedipa, which is kind of maybe a bit of foreshadowing for his later.
Where?
I want to say he does.
Did he invite them in? Oh no! I think it was Oedipa that invited him in. Hold on.
Wait, we're talking about this chapter, right?
This chapter, yeah.
I don't think Oedipa jokingly says that they might come out to the pool with them after they're done with the movie and implied sex. I don't think anyone invites them in.
Okay, hey, y'all might be right. I don't know where I got that.
Well, he absolutely does share liquor with them later in the book. That's not.
Yeah.
Oh no, he asked them to play strip-Botticelli with him.
Does he?
He says Metzger helped her stagger to her feet. Anyone for strip-Botticelli? Which him and Oedipa are already playing it, so that's what I was thinking of.
Yeah.
Which is kind of worse than what I was talking about, if you think about it.
Yeah.
Wait, doesn't that happen after she's already kind of tricked them all to leave?
I think there might be, yeah, because they're supposed to...
It's right after they say they're going to be in the pool.
Yeah, so Metzger is maybe trying to get them to stick around or something. I don't know.
I just interpreted that as a jokingly suave kind of like, hey, anyone up to play the game the two of us already agreed to play? I didn't read it in that way.
I do think it can be maybe interpreted as foreshadowing for his later creepiness.
I feel like we've done a disservice. You guys both had some compliments given to the other songs. I feel like I just need to praise Soon Our Scopes Periscope will aim for Constantinople. That is probably the only reason the song is in the Baby Igor song is in the book.
That line I did like.
That's it though. Please continue.
No, so when I was looking for that part that Luke found about Metzger offering to play strip-Botticelli, that's another time where it comes up that there like a commercial comes up for a Turkish bath in downtown San Narciso, and he says Inverarity owned that too. Did you know that? And then they exchange a few more words, and he said, Oedipa says, "What the hell didn't he own?" Metzger cocked an eyebrow at her. "You tell me." I thought that was a really interesting, like Metzger giving away a little bit of the game, but knowing that Oedipa wasn't going to catch on.
Well, I read it as more of a, are you owned by him too?
Yeah, which I think could be taken like as, is she owned by him, and then also is Metzger owned by him? It could be taken either way, perhaps. One thing I found interesting on that page too, which is another example of Pynchon's absurdity, but their drummer had set up precariously on the diving board.
The diving board, yeah.
Which, like, if he's doing the kick drum, or like, it's going to be bouncing up and down, you would think. Like, you know, I can tell you,
as a drummer, that scene makes me nervous.
Like, yeah,
like there are hard boards, but it is ridiculous.
It's a weird mental image, man.
It really is.
I find it pretty. It lends credence to the theory either that Pierce arranged all of this, or Metzger knew enough to arrange all of this for himself. That seriously, there are almost no answers that Metzger gives Oedipa. He gives yes and no answers to stuff about the movie, and other than that, he almost never seriously responds to any query that she has.
I have to wonder, like, especially going back to the whole him being a child actor thing, and then that bit about lawyers being actors, I thought was great. I really loved that. Do you like, how much of his backstory do you really buy? Like, do you really think that he was a child actor, or do you kind of get the feeling that this is all just an elaborate setup?
I mean, it could be interpreted that he's acting, that he's not even a lawyer, and then he's acting like he's one in this scene. Like, we have no proof that he is one. I don't know.
We have no proof that it's him in the movie. Like, we're just taking his word for it because, at that time, there's no, obviously there's no internet. You can't look him up and verify his name on there.
Yeah,
well,
and I mean,
there is I'm likely to think that he probably was a child actor and probably is a lawyer. It seems reckless to have a non-lawyer execute your will. But I only really believe that he was a child actor because specifically he comes into the bathroom with Oedipa fallen on the ground and says something in his Baby Igor voice.
Oh, yeah. I remember, yeah.
Oh, for Pete's sake, or something.
And there is, I wrote PTSD in the margin, but there's the part where there came from the TV set a terrific explosion, and then mines, cried Metzger, covering his head and rolling away from her, which, I mean, could speak to the fact that he's acting, but it could also speak to the fact, it's just something that I feel like is kind of assumed at this point, but being an actor as a child does seem, you can usually assume that has somehow messed up the person when they reach adulthood. You could probably find exceptions to that rule, but I think you all know what I'm talking about, where often famous child actors seem to struggle with, especially in young adulthood.
Well, and there's a particular trope, which I don't know if I should have looked it up on TV Tropes or something, but there is a trope which has been used extensively since the 60s, and I don't know if it predates this book, of the child actor growing up and wanting to reprise, like somehow believing that he is one of the roles he played. And the most recent example of that I can think of is Steven Yeun in Nope last year.
Yeah, I actually just watched that on Friday.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, I loved it. But yeah,
it's a good movie. But that specifically, like, confusing yourself for a character you played when you were a child is a direct trope, and I don't know if there are any real examples of that. Maybe Peter Sellers, but that's barely. It's more of a dissociative identity disorder than like a specific association with the role. But this might be the first instance of that trope.
And speaking of tropes and stuff, the Pynchon Wiki, we've kind of already been over this a little bit. The Pynchon Wiki points out that comparing a suburban neighborhood or a like urban or suburban sprawl to a printed circuit, the Pynchon Wiki says this description is probably one of, if not the first time, that comparison has been set down in American fiction, which I think is interesting.
Yeah, that makes sense. Do y'all think she actually like bit into Metzger? Do you think that was just illustrious description? Because they never mention it again. Like,
it doesn't come up again, but I really don't know. Like, and like,
why did she do it? Was it just drunken overwhelmedness, just biting?
I mean, it could be flirting, that kind of stuff. I mean, flirting or foreplay or something. That's how I interpreted it.
It almost came off a little bit that way to me as well. One thing I had forgotten until rereading this chapter was Oedipa's age, or at least what we can take for it, is that she's 28.
Yeah, that's revealed in this chapter, yeah.
Yeah, and I don't know that we ever know how old Metzger is, but he's obviously older if he was a child actor in a movie that came out long ago enough to be on TV at that point.
He does scan as younger than 28 to me, but I don't know.
He's probably older just because he's a lawyer, but he's and an estate lawyer for a billionaire. But also, it was a post-war movie. It was made in the late 40s, early 50s at the latest. So he might have been 10.
Yeah, I mean, if it's 1963, let me do the math. He would be late 40s. He would have been born in like 1940. Or I mean, I guess he could have been like as old as like 12 or even a little bit older than that. I mean, it's baby Igor, but
they usually got older kids to play younger kids.
Yeah,
anyway.
No, you're right. Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I don't want to disagree with you too much, but I mean, it is a movie about World War I. There's a reference. Is it in this chapter to movies in the 30s with like the saxophone?
Oh wait, was it World War I? Did I get confused?
Yeah, it is.
Yeah,
it is.
Oh, yeah, okay.
The campaign that it's about, the invasion of like Gallipoli, or however you say it, that is World War I. Yeah, there is a reference to 30s style like movie soundtracks. Yeah, so he could be even older than I was saying, definitely. And this is to go back to Gravity's Rainbow, but I guess I've heard that there's a lot of references to 1930s and 1940s movies in Gravity's Rainbow. I mean, there's some obvious references that I've seen people mention on the subreddit and in general, like to German film from that time. But I do think I've heard that like there's like references to, like made for TV movies from around that time and stuff, that there's a lot of like, if you really like tear it apart and actually know anything about TV and movies from that time, that you'll find a lot of references.
Yeah, from what I understand, the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari is very important both to this book and Gravity's Rainbow. And then I just watched Metropolis a couple weeks ago.
Ooh, I love that movie.
It was fantastic. I thought so, at least. And I can totally see how that influenced him, and not just by proxy via Kubrick. Well, I think Justine, while it's, supposedly the name of the fictional dead mother, could and probably is, given the content of sadomasochism in Pynchon's works in general, a reference to Marquis de Sade.
Can you elaborate on that a little?
No, there's nothing more than I just think.
Okay.
He might have thrown that in there in the same way he, names a later character Genghis Cohen, just a false flag of information.
That's
one
true.
thing I thought was interesting was it's Fangoso Lagoons, and it's a housing development, which then seems to play into Inherent Vice, and Inherent Vice being about real estate in the LA area and the Southern California area, and based around a business cartel called the Golden Fang. Does seem to be like kind of I mean, I think Inherent Vice is kind of a reference back to Fangoso Lagoons.
Definitely. I'm not sure whether Fangoso is specifically particularly resonant in that book, but yeah.
I always find it interesting to kind of connect the dots between all of his work, and I have to wonder how much of it was intentional and how much of it is he just kind of went back and was like, I like that idea, I like that name, I like that concept, I'm going to reuse that or bring that back into the fold in this book.
And it is interesting because people seem to draw a line between the movie Chinatown and Inherent Vice, but I think Grand Lot 49 came out before Chinatown.
Yeah, so Chinatown was like 1974, I think.
I think you're right. Yeah, something like that. And Pynchon's obsession with Southern California real estate would have predated Chinatown, which is interesting.
Just a note, fangoso in Italian means something along the lines of muddy or slimy. So there's just some good irony there in a luxury housing development around a clear blue artificial lake full of stolen treasures from around the world that's just, called Muddy Lake. There's got to be something between the Turkish baths and the Turkish, warfare on screen, but I don't have any clue.
Well, the other thing I was thinking too when I made the connection with the San Narciso and Narcissus and the nymph and all that was, if I remember correctly, in Greek mythology, I should ask my son because he knows a lot about Greek mythology more than I do. If I'm not mistaken, the nymphs in Greek mythology tended to congregate around bodies of water, and most of the reference we get to, really the only reference we get to the nymph in here, there's a lot of mentions of pools and still bodies of water in this chapter as well.
Yeah, I can do a quick rundown of the myth of Narcissus and Echo. Just someone please correct me if I'm wrong, because this is from memory. But basically, a naiad, which is a water nymph named Echo, was viewed as like the most beautiful of her sisters or something. She sang beautifully. She was creative and ambitious, which is weird for a nymph. And one day she sees Narcissus walking through the forest. And I can't remember why she got in hot water with some goddess who was already...
With Hera. I think it was Hera.
Hera, that sounds right, yeah. Who was already interested in Narcissus. And so Hera curses her to never be able to speak her own voice so that she can't allure Narcissus into, her Echo's arms. And so Narcissus is out going for a forest stroll one day when he wanders over to look at a flower and then sees his reflection in the river. And underneath the surface and hidden from his view, because he can't expose herself, she can't expose herself, Echo is just trying to accent his visage so that he keeps looking in the water. And he tries to hello, is anyone there? And she can only copy it. And so he falls in love with this thing, which is his own voice being reflected back at him from someone who is enraptured by his beauty, and dies and becomes another flower.
This is part of what I love about Pynchon, is I always end up going down these rabbit holes of learning weird things, and I love it. Do we want to do quotes? Does anybody have a particular quote that really stuck out?
I really love the image for my ebook. The second page was probably something like third or fourth page. She's driven by a yo-yo dine, and then Oedipa resolved to pull into the next motel she saw, however ugly. Stillness and four walls having at some point become preferable to this illusion of speed, freedom, wind in your hair, unreeling landscape. It wasn't. What the road really was, she fancied, was this hypodermic needle inserted somewhere ahead into the vein of a freeway, a vein nourishing the mainliner LA, keeping it happy, coherent, protected from pain or whatever passes with the city for pain. But were Oedipa some single melted crystal of urban horse, LA really would be no less turned on for her absence.
That's exactly the same quote that I had grabbed too. I love that part.
That was when I first read this book, that was the moment where I was like, holy shit, this guy is a genius.
Yeah.
I think I already kind of went over some of my favorite quotes. One I liked was the part about the sick dick and the Volkswagens. I mean, Volkswagen is yet another reference to Germany, which seems to, especially this book and Gravity's Rainbow, seem to have a lot of, especially Gravity's Rainbow, have a lot of references to Germany. But it says an English group he was fond of at the time but did not believe in, which I found the distinction between, you know, like enjoying someone's music and thinking they're going to make it musically as like a career, like the difference between the two. You know, I've been friends with, there's two different bands in the past like 10 years, 12 years, 15 years that I've been gone to, like local bands that I've gotten to know them as people and gone to a lot of their shows, and kind of, I call myself a groupie, which seems to imply stuff that is not true, but I think you get what I'm saying. Like I was a pretty big fan of the two of them, two different bands. And but I had no belief that they would ever sign a major label deal. You know what I'm saying? Where like there's a difference between enjoying someone's music and thinking that they're going to get famous from the music. Which, this is a bit of an aside, but the band that I was a big groupie for in my late teens, early 20s, the guitarist for that has actually made a career for himself in country music, and he tours and stuff. But
for me, I have one more quote that I really liked, and it's in my edition. It's on page 20. It's right after the commercial for Fangosta Lagoons, and it says, one of Inverarity's interests, Metzger noted, it was to be laced by canals with private landings for power boats, a floating social hall in the middle of an artificial lake, at the bottom of which laid restored galleons imported from the Bahamas, Atlantean fragments of columns and friezes from the Canaries, real human skeletons from Italy, giant clamshells from Indonesia, all for the entertainment of scuba enthusiasts. I took that as an interesting way of looking at a city and the people in it as just being fish in an aquarium, where they're just kind of trapped in this area that they really have no way of getting out of, but you can satiate and satisfy them if you just put enough random shit in there that they can be entertained with. And they won't complain. They'll just be happy and live their little lives swimming around and not really wonder about anything or do anything.
Yeah, there's a few different things that make me think of. I mean, on Reddit, you'll see every like week or two, maybe every month, there will be a post about some neighborhood that's like that, where you can like get around by boat or jet ski or something in the Netherlands or in America. I do kind of have to assume that Pynchon didn't come up with the idea for that kind of neighborhood. It does. I'm really into Ballard, J.G. Ballard, and Ballard does, especially later in his career, focus a lot on self-contained communities and like gated communities, and even in High Rise, which came out in the 70s. High Rise is basically about like a apartment complex. It's all one building, where like you never have to leave the complex, like ever. You can just live there, grocery shop there, like shop for furniture, shop for clothes, all within the complex, which is an interesting concept, and one that I think was a bigger deal in the 60s and 70s than it is today, especially in terms of like architects coming up with that kind of community and stuff. I think there is that was more of a, like I said, it's more of a thing in the 60s and 70s. I think there's a apartment building in Chicago that was like that I want to say I heard about whenever I went to Chicago a few years ago. But I do think that kind of like little tidbit from history is interesting just to think about.
Yeah, I viewed it. I didn't think about it so much as the entrapment side of things, although that's clearly there. It's to me, it's more of just kind of a mockery of how, at that point in time, these housing developments were coming up, promising more and more and more and more. And at the same time, there was this, I think there was some degree of fetishization of Europe, especially, you know, after most cities had rebuilt for the most part post-war in the 60s. And I just viewed Fangoso Lagoons as like what a rich yuppie in California thinks of as what it's like to live in Venice.
That's a good point. I didn't link it to Venice. And I mean, Venice does come up. It's a pretty significant part of Against the Day happens in Venice. I want to say like like a climactic part of like some subplot with the Chums of Chance, like fighting another airship. I think that happens in Venice, right?
Yeah.
Another quote that I liked was I wrote let me find it. I wrote vampiric in the margin because it's Metzger talks about how his mom was really out to casher me, like a piece of beef on the sink. She wanted me drained in white, which can kind of speak to Metzger's. Metzger does have some perhaps vampiric qualities in terms of sucking the life out of people.
Oh, for sure.
And I think it's just an interesting visual image of a little boy, like, you know, being drained of his bodily fluids, his blood and stuff. I think that's what kasher means, is to render something kosher.
Yeah, and there are just two things that link into that. Metzger in German literally just means butcher, but also I think that's supposed to be kind of an indication that Metzger's Jewish, a German Jew.
Yeah, it's a good point. And I want to say this came up in my research for this book. I forget where. It might have been in the like guide to Crying on Block 49. It may have come up in the Pynchon Wiki as well. But there was in Germany, there was I forget exactly all that it was, but there was a link between butchers and the postal service. Like butchers had like their own postal service, or like whenever they went from town to town, they were supposed to like carry letters or something. I'll have to kind of maybe refresh myself on that, but there is a relation between the Trastero type stuff that we get into later in the book and butchers in Europe, and there being like a network of mail going around. So
I just looked it up. There's something on the Britannica.com website that talks about butcher post, and it just says there's really nothing more than this. It just says among these was a so-called butcher post, Metzger post, which was able to combine the carrying of letters with the constant traveling that the trade required.
Yeah, so it's called Metzger post, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, which is interesting. Which obviously links Metzger with even I mean, he's obviously involved, would have to be involved in the conspiracy, but it does kind of deepen that connection.
Yeah.
How about I bring up a couple of quotes that I hate, just to contrast.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it's one sentence. It's just a little bit before the cashering talk.
Mm-hmm.
She knew she looked pretty good. I understand that some people don't agree with me, but it just reads like a 28-year-old, 27-year-old Thomas Pynchon just kind of working out some of his fantasies. Like between that and then I'm not going to read it because I just don't like it that much, is the simultaneous climax moment.
Yeah.
That's just like a guy in his late 20s being horny.
Yeah.
Well, there's that Hollywood movie like We Came Together with Amy Poehler or whatever, where they make fun of that whole thing. And at the risk of outing myself, I mean, I've written, I've written like some stuff with female characters having a specific outfit that would have been a reference to a woman I know, which is pretty cringe if you think about it. But it would surprise me if that's not what it was. Like, Pynchon is probably throwing some stuff in there that is meant to be him kind of hitting on some woman he knows through the book. I would be surprised if it wasn't. I mean, we'll never figure that out because obviously we haven't been in the room with Pynchon for his whole life. But I do think that writers do that.
Yeah, and that's not the issue, I guess, for me at least. I wouldn't call that, pathetic or anything. It's just, you write literally what you know. You've seen someone in an outfit, whatever. It's just literally the phrasing of "she knew she looked good" that really pisses me off.
Yeah, and it does go back to the narcissism too, I think.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, you're right. I hadn't thought about that.
It does. I think I see where you're coming from with it. Well, I think I see both sides where I see what he's getting at, what he's trying to say. I just don't think it's said well.
Yeah, I mean, and every other part of like delving into how Oedipa thinks about herself, we get some grand allegory or metaphor rooted in like ancient folklore or something. And then in this case, it's just she knew she looked good. It's out of place. It doesn't sound like Oedipa. I don't know. It's weird. But at the same time, it's salient for that reason. Like, why does it matter that she knows she looks good?
Yeah. How do you feel like overall, after we've kind of talked about it, like what were your overall thoughts on the chapter itself and the book up to this point? Obviously, we've all read it before, but how are you feeling at this point?
I do think we're kind of still in the rising action section. I mean, there's parts in the first chapter that I would say are really interesting and do a good job of like developing the characters. It's something we talked about last week, but there's so much time spent on Mucho Mas in the first chapter, and he's a pretty minor character. I don't think the book would lose that much if he was just kind of a faceless husband who was never really detailed. But I mean, we're still in the rising action. It is interesting. I mean, there's the paragraph, this is the whole book in one phrase. Either he made up the whole thing, Oedipa thought suddenly, or it goes into he bribed the engineer. Like, it's all part of a plot, an elaborate seduction plot. Oh, Metzger, like that's the whole book in a paragraph. Because I don't think, I mean, thinking about the later chapters, it's as somebody who has gotten drunk or a little bit drunk and wandered around a foreign city, like some of the later chapters I just find more evocative and more interesting on a sentence by sentence level, where I was like right there with the narrator. These first two chapters are a bit meandering, and not necessarily like, I wouldn't call them super tight. Like, I mean, Will was talking about that she knew she looked pretty good, which it doesn't need to be in there. And there is stuff in the later chapters where there's paragraphs and paragraphs where I would argue that pretty much all of it needs to be in there. But I mean, it's still, I don't know. I mean, I remember the first time I was reading it, I was super interested and very, very like interested in all the sides and stuff. I do think he does a good job of leading into what's to come in these first two chapters.
Yeah, I can remember the first time I read it, and really, I mean, each of the subsequent times I've read it as well. This is the chapter that kind of really, the book has kind of really sunk its hooks into me because of the ramping up of the paranoia and the start of questioning everything and how much of this is really happening and how much of it is set up. But at the same time, it's also a really bleak ending, which is not unusual for Pynchon, especially at this time, because Gravity's Rainbow had a lot of that. I mean, a lot of his early stuff was a lot more bleak than a lot of his later stuff, but this one, just that ending of chapter 2, I almost never it was hard for me to end on this one and not keep going forward, just because the ending of this chapter is just so uncomfortable. I usually just want to keep going forward just to put it past it. But I mean, I like it. I think it's a good chapter. It does what it needs to do as far as moving the plot forward and everything.
I do think it's interesting that we don't get Oedipa's feelings on the sexual assault at the end, where it seems to be kind of deliberately like she maybe is already not wanting to think about it, or is already kind of just pushing it away, which I do think can be a pretty common response to trauma, is just to not examine it, to stick it in a box.
Exactly. And I think that comes up again in Against the Day with was it Lake?
Yeah.
That you know, by the end of the book, we kind of understand that like she just like what happened was awful and she knew it was awful, but she didn't want to keep reliving it. She just wanted to move on with her life and be done with it.
So I guess this brings me to the point where I'm going to raise a question. Is it why is she crying in the last moments? Is it because of the assault? Is it because she realizes it was an assault? Was she fine with it as long as she didn't know that Metzger, on his way to the motel that day, had been planning on ending up in her pants? Is it she's crying just because she misses Pierce and Metzger reminded her of that? All of these seem like valid readings to me.
Yeah, I do think that Metzger is repeating that Pierce said that she wouldn't be easy does seem to imply that the seduction was part of the plan.
Mm-hmm.
And then that leads right into her crying, which could speak to the fact that, you know, like them getting together, because I do think that she consents during the foreplay. I mean, you can't consent when you're asleep. I want to, you know, like I think we all agree on that.
Yeah.
But I think, you know, it does kind of speak to the fact that she might have been like legitimately seduced and legitimately starting to have feelings for Metzger, and then Metzger kind of seems to imply to her that it was just like a challenge he was looking to overcome or something like that, you know, like it does seem to that the fact that Pierce said that she wouldn't be easy and that they ended up hooking up seems to kind of paint Metzger as pretty heartless and emotionless.
Yeah, I read it the exact same way. I think it was that she understanding what happened, that it wasn't consensual, but there was still some feeling going into it. And then he just completely just knocks her down and just, you know, that whole kind of like, you were nothing, this was just a challenge and I won kind of thing. It's just like one of the most awful things that you like. It's a really just disgusting example of adding insult to injury at that point.
Yeah, because regardless of the morality of it, there are people who have been in situations that look like, you know, her and Metzger's sexual congress, that they don't take it as traumatic. And not to say that they should or they shouldn't, but it's just they don't conceptualize it that way, whether because they trust the person or whatever. There's totally a world in which she doesn't care about that loss of consent in the moments before sex because she did fully intend to consent. But it's just like you said, it's a horrible thing to say.
Yeah.
Really
And I do think that one thing that can be lost in this book is that this book is basically a book about the grieving process, and about death and how the death of a loved one can affect you. So it does seem to make sense that the chapter ending and that the book itself is pretty dark. But I think that you can kind of lose sight of that pretty easily with this book, with all of the absurdity and all the little jokes. And you know what I'm saying? Like it is kind of, I don't want to say all over the place, because it's a very Pynchon thing to kind of do this whole like laugh to keep from crying thing. I think that comes up a lot in Pynchon. So
I do want to invite listeners to write in with their interpretation, not only of that part in particular, but of everything that we've talked about. I really kind of want to get an idea of how other people are taking all of this in and what they're getting out of it.
Something I just connected with what you just said, Luke. The moment where we see Fangoso Lagoons and paragraph ends with printed circuit, gently curving streets, private access to the water, Book of the Dead. The first sentence is one of Inverarity's interests, Metzger noted. Is it just supposed to be the book of that dead guy, generalized as kind of a tongue-in-cheek reference?
I mean, I just now thought of this, but a will, especially a will that's going to be pretty long and complicated, like Pierce's, would be a Book of the Dead, like a literal Book of the Dead.
Yeah. But just to answer your question, I guess, Cody, I don't like this chapter very much. I think it's a good way to segue, I suppose, from chapter 1 into the world of Oedipa just kind of losing it and everything around her seeming to turn inward and away at the same time. But I do not, like you said, I don't like this chapter. The rape scene is horrible. And reading through it, knowing the power that Pierce had, knowing the power that Metzger had in those moments, really makes the whole thing nauseating for me. It's still really beautifully written in many places, and there are plenty of points at which I laugh, but it's probably my least favorite of the book, just because it's so disgusting.
That's absolutely fair.
It does end on a very sour note. Yeah,
it does. Yeah.
Like, you can sit there and just feel every single lie Metzger says every single time that Oedipa tries to put up a boundary, then he steamrolls it. And it's just it's tragic.
Yeah. What do you think is the most pinch-on part of the chapter?
So I've been kind of raring to go with this one, but a band being called the Paranoids, like that's literally like the most pinch-in band name that you can come up with. Like, and it's 2 words, it's not some long like blah 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 and the blah blah blah. It's just the Paranoids, which, I mean, anyone who's read any Pynchon knows that paranoia is pretty much the central unifying theme, I would say, for all of his works. And you can't get more Pynchon than that.
Yeah, for sure. I think for me it was the circuit board comparison, not only in its imagery, but in just in the way it was written. I thought it was very beautifully done. And it was a good example of his prose. And we already went over that quote, so I don't want to reread it. But that was to me the most Pynchon part, until Luke mentioned the Paranoids. I think that probably is the most Pynchon part of the chapter.
Yeah, that's pretty close. But I had in mind both those ideas, but also the crystal of urban horse scene, as well as the entire massive paragraph where Oedipa walks into the bathroom and quickly undressed and began putting on as much as she could of the clothing she brought with her. 6 pairs of panties in assorted colors, girdle, 3 pairs of nylons, 3 brassieres, 2 pairs stretched slacks, 4 half slips, 1 black sheath, 2 summer dresses, half dozen A-line skirts, 3 sweaters, 2 blouses, quilted wrapper, baby blue peignoir, and Orlan muumuu. And it's just like, why the hell did she bring all of that?
Right. For what's essentially like a brief road trip
to Southern California.
Yeah.
Something to kind of build on that some single melted crystal of urban horse. Crystal, as someone who's really into Breaking Bad, crystal makes me think of crystal meth. Horse is apparently, according to the Pynchon wiki, could be a reference to heroin.
Yeah, that's pretty.
There's hypodermic needle, and then a few phrases later, into the vein, and then at the end of that paragraph it says turned on, which would have been a reference to doing drugs back then. So that is a pretty druggy little section of the chapter.
Yeah, that whole thing, that right there, next to, I suppose, actually the Herrero chapter and the nose job chapter in V, are really the inciting points for Pynchon's anti-urban crusade. He really seems to think of them as things which use human life as fuel for production that wear them out and spit them back into the suburbs.
Oh, for sure, yeah.
And heroin's a pretty damn good comparison for that. And this book was written way back in the day when you bought heroin, it was actually crystals. It wasn't a weird glob of tar or random powder.
All right. Well, do y'all have any final thoughts or anything that you wanted to bring up before we end it?
I just appreciate the pun of cashier on cashiered, where Oedipa just goes about you and your mother. But that's it.
Yeah. Chapter 3 is next week, and it's a long one, so we will have a lot to talk about. Unless, I don't know, we might even want to talk about splitting it up into 2 parts, because it's 35 pages in my edition.
Yeah, and I mean, it'll just depend on how much we want to tear apart it's the one with the play, right?
Yeah, I might want to. It might be best if we do a bonus episode just explaining the play, because I feel like the play is something that is completely intractable for most first-time readers, but is either, depending on your interpretation of the whole book, crucial and important to the story of how the CIA assassinated JFK, or it's, if you ask me, just it's really dense with a lot of humor.
I think that's we're going to have to talk about that, because that part is one that I always have intended to really go further into and really look into, but I just haven't ever given myself the time to do it. So now I don't have an excuse not to do it. So we'll talk about that. Yeah, I think maybe splitting it up might be a good idea, or just at least doing that bonus episode that you talked about.
Yeah, I've like I said, my last read through of it, I feel like I understand the play now, and I truly understand how ridiculous and stupid it is, and how it might just be a joke that Pynchon put it in there in the first place to make people figure it out.
I mean, it would be in line with his style for sure.
Yeah.
All right. Well, please feel free to send us an email, mappingthezonepod@gmail.com. We really would like to hear, y'all's thoughts and feedback. And I think bringing on different points of view is important, especially for Pynchon. Send questions if you have them about chapters 1 and 2. Send questions about chapter 3 so we can talk about them when we do chapter 3. We will see everyone next week.
Bye.
Alrighty, see y'all.